Hello everyone, welcome once again to my YouTube channel. My name is Benga Adeyemo. I'm a Power BI developer and I also love sharing Power BI content. Now today I'm going to be talking to you about query dependencies. Now what is query dependencies? Query dependencies refers to the relationship between different tables within your Power Query. It refers to how different queries depend on each other. Now, the reason why this topic is very important for you to know as a Power BI developer is that as a Power BI developer, you need to troubleshoot your queries, you need to manage your queries well, and you also need to optimize your queries. And you also want to ensure that when you click on that refresh button, you want your queries to refresh as fast as possible. Now, I'm going to be diving into the four key aspects of query dependencies. Number one, the direct dependency. Number two, independent queries. Number three, change dependencies. And number four, external dependencies. Now let's dive straight into my laptop and I'm going to show you what I mean by query dependencies. So I am now in my Power Query editor. Now let's assume that you are a new Power BI developer in a new organization, right? You just got employed, and instead of them telling you to create new reports, what they're asking you to do in your first 3 months is to optimize the reports that were created before you were employed. You want to optimize them such that when they click on refresh, the refresh happens fast, and optimizing your queries generally. Now, what you need to do to start with is to click on your view on the menu, and you also click on query dependencies. So I'm clicking on query dependencies now. Now you will see this layout, but I love using the third one on the list, which is the left to right layout. You can try out the other layouts, but I love using the left to right layouts. Now you will see the source of the different tables, or what we call queries, right? And you will see how they are related to each other, how they are related to each other. Now I'm going to explain some things to you. Now this is the source. What you're seeing here is the source. It's telling me that this particular data source is from my OneDrive, C drive, OneDrive, PL300 class folder, and it's the CSV file. Interesting, right? Now, if I click on this, it's going to show me that all of these tables here depend on this source, right? Because these tables came from this source. Nice. Now, what I did here, let me tell you what I did here. When I brought in the data originally, I only had sales table. Now I duplicated this sales table for me to be able to create all of these different dimensions, what we call logical model, right? So I duplicated this sales table to have all these other tables here. Now, let me click on this table, ship mode 2. You will see that for me to create ship mode 2, I duplicated ship mode table here to create the ship mode 2, right? Oh, I did a reference rather. I did a reference, not duplicate. I did a reference. So that's why you see that when I click on ship mode 2, it's linking up to tell me here that I created this table by referencing ship mode. So if anything happens to ship mode table, it's going to definitely affect the ship mode 2 table. And if anything happens to my source, it's going to affect ship mode, it's going to affect ship mode 2. Because this is the chain. They are all depending on each other. Now, if I click on this other one, this is SQL Server. This query one came from this SQL Server, right? The transactions database. I wrote some queries for me to import this into Power BI desktop, into my Power Query. Now, what I'm going to do now is this. So let me show you now the four key aspects of the query dependencies. Now, let's talk about the first one, which is direct dependency. Now, what is direct dependency? Direct dependency happens when one query depends on another query, right? For example, if query B is built using query A, then query B depends on query A. Query B is built using query A, then query B depends on query A. Good. It means that if something happens to query A, maybe query A is modified or deleted, then query B will be affected, right? So, for example, query A might be the one extracting the raw sales data, and query B might, apply transformations depending on on query A. Now, let's see how this works. So, when we say query dependencies, we are not just referring to just the different tables, which we refer to as queries here. We're also talking about even the transformation steps also, right? It applies to all the transformation steps and the tables. Now, let's see this. So, for example, on this my shipment table, this is my first step of transformation here is the source, right? Now, every other transformation steps here, the promoted headers, the change type, remove other columns, blah, 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 that I have here, they are all depending on the source. If anything happens to the source, then all of these, they are nothing, right? So they are depending on the source. So this is like the query A, which is the source, and promoted headers is like query B, and you have that and so on and so forth, right? So if something happens to the source, all these transformation steps, the promoted headers, right, is going to be affected, because what headers is it going to promote if there's no data, if there's no source, right? So that is direct dependency. So let's say change type also is depending on promoted headers, right? If something happens to promoted headers, it's going to affect change type, right? So that is direct dependency, when something directly depends on the other, right? Now let's go to the second aspect, which is independent queries. Now, these queries refers to the source. That is, they don't reference any other queries. They are the ones that pull data directly, right? For example, a query that directly loads data from an Excel file. For example, maybe for your SQL database or your APIs, right? When you use API to import data, right? The good thing about independent queries is that they load very fast, right? And they might, or let's say they don't impact other queries, right? So, for example, query A pulls data from SQL database and loads it directly into Power BI without referencing any other query. So, just like I was explaining earlier, if you look at the source, you see that the source can stand on its own, right? As independent query. They are not depending on one previous query before now, right? They can stand on their own. So that is independent query. They are always like the source, right? Because they are the ones that pull the data inside Power Query, right? So it's not as if they are depending on one other query, or although they are the way they have might also affect the optimization of other queries, right? That are within your applied steps. But we are still going to get to that. So the summary of independent queries is that they can stand alone on their own. They don't really impact the other queries, right? And also the fact that they are always the source. They are the ones that they are the queries that pulls the data inside Power Query, right? Now let's also go to the third one. The third one, which is change dependencies. Interesting. So this one is saying if we have query A, B, and C, and query C will depend on query B will depend on query A. It means that if anything happens to any of them, it will affect the other one. So, for example, if something happens to query B, query C will be affected. If anything happens to query A, right, query B and query C will be affected, right? Because query C depends on query B depends on query A, right? Example, query A loads customer data, that's the source. Query B filters query A to show only active customers. It means that you are filtered on the query, on your table, to only filter active customer, right? And query B matches with sales table to analyze revenue from active customers. So revenue is come from another table to join that particular query. So now if something happens to query C, I'm telling you, oh sorry, not query B rather, or query A, query C is nothing, right? Query C is going to just show an error, right? So query C depends on query B depends on query A. Now let's go to the Power BI, to Power Query, to show you what that means. So for example, this is query A, this is query B, this is query C, this is query D, E, blah blah blah. So if something happens to the source, query B and query C will be affected. If the source is modified, or every other transformation steps here is going to be affected. Let's say, for example, let's look at this one also that I showed you the other time, that ship mode, for example, I created this ship mode 2 by referencing ship mode. So ship mode serves as the source for ship mode 2. If something happens to ship mode, it's going to also reflect on ship mode 2 because it is referencing ship mode table, right? So let's say I create another table again. Maybe let me just right click here and create another one again and reference again. It now becomes ship mode 3 now. Aha. So I created ship mode 3 from ship mode, right? And I created ship mode 2 from ship mode. So ship mode 3 was created from ship mode 2. Ship mode 2 was created from ship mode. Now, if we go to the query dependencies now, right, what you will now see, you will see it very clearly and interesting. So you will see now, if I click on ship mode 3, it's telling me that ship mode 3 was created from ship mode 2, and ship mode 2 was created from ship mode, and ship mode was created from the source, right? Interesting. That is change dependent. When there is that chain of dependencies, it might be a long chain, it might be a short chain of dependencies, depending on what is referencing what, right? So, guys, as part of explaining chain dependencies, I also want to show us something interesting. So, when I go back to my query dependency window and I go back to that layout, now, if you look at this, if I click on ship mode, you will see that it's showing the other tables that are depending on this ship mode table, because they were created based on referencing this one. Now you also see that it's also showing me ship mode ID. This ship mode ID is a list, right? I created this list from this table. It means that this list is also depending on the ship mode table, right? Because I created this list from the ship mode table. Now, this the from the ship mode ID table, I also created my parameter, right? So my parameter is depending on the ship mode ID list, right? And also my parameter is also filtering information inside the sales table. So you see how interesting this is, right? You see how everything is linking to each other, how they are depending on each other. Now, from the source, right, to the ship mode table, right? Now, from the ship mode table, I created the ship mode ID, right, which is the list. From the ship mode ID, I also created a parameter. Now, this parameter is now filtering the information inside the sales table, right? You see how the dependency chain moves from the source to ship mode and to the list to the parameter and to the sales table, right? So this will tell you exactly how they are depending on each other. What is depending on what? Now, this ship mode table, I also use that to create a ship mode 2 and ship mode 3. Interesting, right? Now, let's go to the last one, which is external dependencies. External dependencies. Now, what we mean by external dependencies in this context is this. Now, what we mean by external dependencies is that these are queries that rely on external data source, right? Now, for example, if something happens to the source, right, it's going to affect every other tables or every other queries that came from that source, right? It means that even this the applied step or source, right, is also relying on an external source, right? So, for example, sales table, for example, if you look at the source here, right, the source is a CSV file, right? It's a CSV file. If something happens to that CSV file, maybe I remove that CSV file from that folder or I delete that CSV file, right? Then every other table, maybe every other queries or tables in this Power Query is going to be affected, especially the ones in sales group here. They are all going to be affected, right? Because they are all relying on that CSV file that I have in my OneDrive, because that is the source. So if something happens to that source, which is the main area, the main source of data for all these transformation steps, all these other queries depending on each other. If something happens to the source of that data itself, it's going to affect or modify what happens to the tables or the queries that I have in my Power Query. So that is the four key aspects of query dependencies.